I always think it's helpful to discern the difference between fear and anxiety. So, fear is the response to a direct threat. And what we're talking about there is a very real threat in the moment. When that happens, our bodies are designed so that our fight and flight instinct kicks in, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in. But once that threat is gone, our system is designed to rebalance and then go back to a rest state. With anxiety, especially chronic anxiety, that doesn't happen. So anxiety is a persistent response to perceived threats. And the key word here is perceived. So we can perceive threats when we're at work and we're about to go into a meeting. We can perceive threats when we're about to go into social interactions. We can perceive threats when we're just going about our day and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so we perceive all of that as potentially dangerous. And the nervous system then never resets. And the question that I always had around this is, why do some people perceive life itself, the future, or whatever situation that you may be dealing with in your life, as a threat, and respond in a kind of fearful way when other personalities don't seem to have that issue? So I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, and what I discovered is that anxiety itself, in certain personality types, tends to be more embedded in unresolved emotional trauma. So what exactly does that mean? I'm not talking about trauma of specific events, like what happens in PTSD. This is more along the lines of repeated micro-trauma or relational trauma, where in our development as kids, we weren't emotionally supported in an appropriate way. And that's actually true for a lot of us. This doesn't mean that we weren't loved, doesn't mean that we didn't get what we needed, but in a lot of these areas, we were wounded and we never dealt with it because as kids, we just don't have the tools. We don't have the capacity. We may not have had the support. The holding environment in which we developed got disrupted somehow. And this pretty much happens for everybody. This quote is by Dr. Gabor Mate. If you haven't read his books, I really highly recommend it, especially The Myth of Normal. And what he says is that trauma is a wound and an unhealed one, and one that the person is compelled to defend against by means of constricting his or her own ability to feel, to be present, and to respond flexibly to situations. Now let's just take a moment to dissect exactly what that means. It means that for a lot of us, when we experience anxiety, it's because we haven't processed emotions that are related to unresolved trauma. So as an example for me, my core wound was always feeling like I never really mattered enough. I wasn't really good enough for my parents or for the culture or for society, etc., etc. That ended up leading to a kind of perfectionism, a lot of trying and efforting to be someone. And all of that was to avoid this core wound and the pain of not feeling like I was enough. And I was utterly constricted by this kind of inner structure that kept trying to protect me from feeling that. And meanwhile, what happens is the emotional backlog gets bigger and bigger till your actual nervous system can't handle it anymore. And what that continually puts us into is this fight, flight, freeze response. And this is where all the physical symptoms start coming in. For some people, they might orient toward fighting. But for those of us who struggle with anxiety, we may tend toward flight or freeze. We tend toward hiding. We tend toward a fear-based response as a protective way to survive. But if you look back in your history, you probably made some kind of decision that it wasn't safe to fight. So instead, you're going to hide. I know that was the case for me, where I had an older brother. I couldn't practically fight him all the time. So I had to learn how to hide. I had to learn how to maneuver, how to make everybody feel like things were okay. When we continually ignore the emotional trauma of our past, the physical symptoms start amping up. And this is where we have insomnia, where we wake up in the middle of the night, where we have panic attacks that affects our digestive issues, shortness of breath, shakiness, dizziness, and so forth. And all of these things happen because the nervous system isn't able to shift back to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest state. So just imagine, and you can probably tune in to how this feels in the body right now, of having a nervous system that's continually wired and activated in a way that it cannot rest. And what I'm saying here is that a big part of the reason for that is because of the emotional backlog that you have. It leads us to an overloaded nervous system when we don't process hurt, when we don't process wounding, and we end up not having a baseline for us to relax anymore. And that leads us to the number one mistake that most of us make when we first encounter anxiety or when we're trying to deal with it, is that we just try to avoid it. And this is a habit that we have probably developed since we were kids because we had to do that when we didn't have the proper support or the proper environment to hold our feelings, to process them, to have compassion for them. What we ended up doing as kids is completely shutting that down. We just didn't have the capacity to deal with it, to handle it, to understand it, and therefore to process it. And so we developed a pattern likely of avoiding the anxiety itself. And that leads to all sorts of defense mechanisms and strategies, helping us to avoid the discomfort and pain that we experienced early on in our childhood. So we might tend to procrastinate, we might avoid life itself, we might avoid conversations, confrontations, we might feel the need to fake confidence, we might pretend that anxiety isn't there at all. So in my case, I did a lot of skill building, perfecting, trying to improve myself to the point that I couldn't be criticized. Clearly, we as a society have a tendency to medicate and to try to numb. So we might binge watch TV, or we might just hide in our beds because we don't want to actually feel the discomfort. It's legitimately painful to feel the discomfort and the pain. So there is a good reason why we do that. But as counterintuitive as it sounds, the number one way for us to actually understand, dissolve, and heal anxiety is to turn toward the wound. And I know that when I say this, most people are like, no thanks. But it is really the only option if we want to truly be free of anxiety, because this is exactly where it's coming from. The root cause of anxiety and the emotions and the reactivity around it that never got dealt with and that most of us have not processed makes it much worse when we avoid it. So the question then is, how do we turn toward the wound? This is the step-by-step process, and I've tried to distill this down so that it's easily comprehensible. First, we need to shift the nervous system back to our rest state. And that's easier said than done. But when we're able to do that, we start developing a kind of baseline so your body can recognize, oh, okay, there's actually a space in myself that I can experience where anxiety is not activated, where there's a baseline of calm and stillness. Then we need to actually shift our relationship with anxiety. And the third step here is then processing our emotional trauma. And that begins with unraveling all of our judgments that we have about emotions and feelings. Most of us, before we started this work, have a lot of criticism, a lot of judgment around our emotions because they weren't safe. So it may not have been safe to be angry or safe to be sad. In some cases, it wasn't safe to be happy. For instance, you might not have been safe thriving and being full and having a big presence. And so all of that results in unprocessed emotions that we had to repress, which again, if we avoid, we don't actually have the opportunity to heal. And the physical symptoms that we experience on a consistent basis are actually signals from our bodies telling us that we do need to address this. Once we address it, those symptoms start to dissolve and start to melt away.